As you've read, our development of language is one of the tangible indications of our cognition and is part of what helps define modern humans. But language does not depend only on the vocal utterances of sounds, rather, it depends on the structure that we, or our different human cultures, create. In today's lesson, we'll explore in greater depth some of the peculiarities of human language. Your assigned readings covered the basics, the structural units of language, that is, phonemes and morphemes, as well as the basic rules for language, that is, grammar and semantics. Of course, different languages have different structural units and rules. Take, for instance, syntax. Different languages follow different syntactical rules. In English, word order is usually subject, then verb, then objects. We might not realize it, but when words are in the wrong order, when they use the wrong syntax, it's difficult to understand the meaning of a phrase or sentence. Take this sentence on screen, for instance. I returned the test to them. This follows our established English word order, subject, verb, then objects. If I change the word order just a little, though, it sounds odd, doesn't it? To them I returned the tests. Kinda like Yoda speech. In addition to the shifts in phonemes, it's often the syntax that is troublesome when we're learning a new language, because little alterations can denote the difference between being fluent or not being fluent in a new language. Take, as an example, more extended syntax rules. In English, adjectives are placed before nouns. Here's my dog Snowball. He's obviously a furry white dog. In English. In Spanish, though, if I tried to use the same word order, it sounds funny. I wouldn't say un peludo blanco perro, because in Spanish, adjectives appear after a noun. Instead, I'd say un perro blanco peludo, which in English would sound weird, a dog white furry. So beyond these basic building units, all language has 6 important features. We can call them principles. One is semanticity. This means that the sounds of human language convey meaning. Other sounds we make, such as coughing or clearing our throats, are not a regular part of our language because they do not usually convey meaning. Although, of course, a well-placed cough can convey plenty of meaning. The arbitrariness of language is another principle. There is no inherent connection between the symbols in a language and the meanings those symbols convey. Might there have been a connection at some point in the past? Well, sure, but not now. Think about it. The word dog bears no inherent resemblance to the 4-legged furry creature we indicate when we mean that word. The word whale is a small symbol, 5 letters, 1 morpheme, for a very big thing. The word microorganism is the reverse. Our knowledge of a language, what we sometimes refer to as fluency, involves knowing the arbitrary connections of language. Another feature of language is the flexibility of symbols. The principle of arbitrariness makes the connection between symbol and meaning changeable over time and space and inventable. See what I did there with the word inventable? Let's look at this phenomenon through a controversial word with a negative connotation today. In the 14th century, the English word that appears on screen, faggot, meant a bundle of sticks or twigs, which was burned for fuel. By the 16th century, during the start of the Reformation in England, this word was mostly used to reference the bundles of fuel used when burning heretics at the stake. In the middle of the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, this word began to be used in a derogatory fashion against women who were considered troublesome or lazy or otherwise useless. And then, in the early 20th century, North American English speakers began using this word to refer to men who performed in drag. But by the mid-1920s, it was used as a derogatory term to reference homosexual men. By the 21st century, while this word was still overwhelmingly used to reference homosexual men in a negative way, it had expanded to sometimes reference homosexual women negatively as well. At the same time, some in the LGBTQ community are taking back the word, making it a statement of pride in their sexual identity. Who knows precisely what this word might mean in another 50 years? A corollary to arbitrariness and flexibility is naming. We humans assign names to all the objects in our environment. When we're in a strange setting, we may not know the name of everything, but it doesn't occur to us to think that the things in that environment don't have a name. This principle of language is very clear when observing pre- or early language infants. They point at things in their environment, often because they've picked up on this principle of naming, and they want to know what things are called. The principle of displacement in language enables us to talk about something other than the present moment. We can talk about the past or the future thanks to semantics, and specifically thanks to verb tenses. We can also talk about abstract concepts or people and things that are far away thanks to displacement. Finally, the principle of productivity or generativity holds that we generate sentences rather than repeat them. Language is a creative process as opposed to a repetitive one. We can come up with new expressions for new objects, and we can manipulate the symbols we have in new ways. For instance, in 1897, English adapted a French word which itself had been created from the combination of a Greek word meaning self and a French word meaning movable. And that's how the word automobile entered the English lexicon. Now, very obviously, childhood represents a critical period for mastering certain aspects of language. All children are born with the ability to speak any human language, but that ability ends after the first few years of life, once an infant is exposed to the phonemes and morphemes of their native language. The earlier a person learns a second language, the more native-like their fluency. So, what happens to someone who doesn't develop language the way most of us do, through pretty constant exposure to others' speech? Well, for some people, verbal language is delayed or not fully present because of deafness. When diagnosed early, these individuals can be fitted with a cochlear implant and still learn the phonemes and morphemes of their native language. With or without the implant, deaf individuals can learn sign language, which has its own syntax and grammar. There are over 100 documented signed languages. Other people are simply not afforded the same opportunity to learn language because of their home situation in childhood. Studies of feral children, children raised without or with little human companionship, have shown that if a child remains linguistically isolated until about age 7, they have a much harder time picking up any language. After age 9, children lose the ability to master any language if they have been linguistically isolated. Of course, there are individuals who are raised with multiple languages from birth or early childhood. Global surveys indicate that about 2/3 of the world's children are raised as bilingual speakers. In the United States, about 20% of residents are bilingual. This bilingualism in the United States is a relatively recent phenomenon. In 1980, only 10% of U.S. residents reported being bilingual speakers. In our city of Austin, Texas, the most commonly spoken languages besides English are Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Hindi. In other words, Austin, Texas is very much a city of bilinguals. There are two types of bilingualism. Additive bilingualism is when people master a second language without losing their first language. This is the goal of language education globally, and this is how most people around the world experience bilingualism. Subtractive bilingualism is when people learn a second language, but this second language replaces their first language. Throughout much of the 20th century, immigrant students in the United States were pressured to learn English and were only rarely encouraged to remain fluent or even practice their first language. One of the reasons why U.S. schools did not at that time encourage the retention of immigrant languages was because of the mistaken belief that bilingualism led to deficits in thinking. People used to believe that maintaining both languages used up more of a finite amount of memory. Early studies which tested this faulty belief found the opposite is true. Bilinguals were more advanced in school. They performed better on tests of first language skills, and they showed greater mental flexibility. Since the middle of the 20th century, further studies have found that bilinguals have a number of important advantages over monolinguals, including greater expertise in their first or native language. They can better recognize and understand the underlying grammar of their native languages. Bilinguals are also more likely to appreciate the phonological components of language, that is, they recognize the different phonemes more easily. Bilinguals are better at paying attention to the more subtle aspects of a language task. For instance, bilinguals more easily recognize that the sentence, "the cat barks," is grammatically correct in English, the word order is correct, but semantically incorrect because they know that cats don't bark. Bilinguals are also quicker to recognize that the names assigned to concepts are arbitrary. A cow could just have easily been named a deer. And here's another example. In English, much has been written about the masculine term history, and how the term is innately biased because it includes the masculine pronoun his. But this argument makes no sense to a Spanish speaker. La historia is a feminine noun. An intriguing idea about language deals with whether or not language determines the way we think. Psychologist Benjamin Lee Whorf believes it does. His linguistic determinism hypothesis argues that different languages impose different conceptions of reality, that our language determines our reality. His linguistic relativity hypothesis suggests that cognitive processes are different for different languages. Now, studies, especially those done on bilingual speakers, have seemed to support this hypothesis, at least in some ways. Bilinguals report having a different sense of self depending on which language they're using. They may even reveal different personality traits when taking the same test in two different languages. And despite the studies and self-reports, most linguists agree that to say that language determines the way we think is probably too strong a statement, but that it's true that words influence our thinking. Let's look at an example. Psychologist William Lutz studied the extent to which words can influence our thinking by studying doublespeak. That's language designed to alter our perception of reality and corrupt our thinking processes. Consider these 5 phrases on the screen. Try your best to revise each phrase into plain American English. Are you ready? Pause the screen for a moment and try your best. Oh, here are the answers from Lutz's study. Revenue enhancement is a tax increase. Inoperative statements are lies. A negative patient care outcome is clearly death. A period of accelerated negative growth is a recession. And a pupil station, well, that's a student desk. A doublespeak can be humorous, but it can also be used to avoid responsibility, to make the bad seem good, the negative positive, the unpleasant attractive. Lutz suggested after his study that doublespeak has 4 different forms. The first is euphemism, when an inoffensive or positive word or phrase is used to avoid a harsh, unpleasant, or distasteful reality. Euphemism is what makes a tax increase become a revenue enhancement for the government, or lies to become inoperative statements. That's so much nicer than thinking that you were lied to, isn't it? Jargon is the use of the specialized disciplinary language of a trade or a profession. For instance, medical professionals may tell you that you have multiple hematomas after an accident, and that sounds alarming. Or they could just tell you that you have multiple bruises. Gobbledygook or bureaucratese is when words are piled up, they overwhelm the audience with long sentences. This is sometimes the result of carelessness or sloppy thinking, like when y'all turn to a thesaurus when writing a paper in a desperate attempt to make that paper longer. Sometimes, though, bureaucratese is used to provide the appearance of communication or clarity when none actually exists. Finally, Lutz identified inflated language as an attempt to make the ordinary seem extraordinary, to make the mundane, the everyday, seem unique. For instance, when digital thermometers, first used medically in the late 1950s, were marketed to the general public, ads often referred to them as digital fever computers, associating them with cutting-edge technology, computers, and thus implying that you could have a computer in your own home. Well, language is one of the hallmarks of the human condition, and for a very long time we thought we were the only ones with language. But now, as animal psychologists begin to deepen their study of the animal condition, it seems like we might not be alone when it comes to language. And wouldn't that be fun to consider, that we could learn the language of other species on Earth? That's something for one of you all to figure out in your future career.